Right, well, welcome all of you once again to what is in fact the last in the pre-Christmas chunk of London lectures. The lectures will resume again after the break on the 13th of January, and that one will be in Foyles rather than here. So it's a great pleasure to welcome this evening's speaker, Professor Louise Antony. Louise is Professor of Philosophy Emerita at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She's held a great variety of academic positions prior to that, which I won't attempt to recite. She's well known for her work on, among other things, philosophy of language, the philosophy of mind, the philosophy of religion, and feminist philosophy, in which she's associated with analytic feminism. She's published very widely and has also edited a number of collections of essays, one of which is called A Mind of One's Own. And I'm only telling you that because it's got such a marvellous title. I'm not saying it's the best collection, they're probably all equally wonderful. But thank you very much for joining us this evening, Louise. The title of Louise's talk is Against Amelioration.
Well, thanks very much for coming out. This talk is based on a longer and very dry, academically dry talk. So I hope that I have managed to pull out the intelligible part of that without sacrificing too much essential detail. I came of political age in the early 1970s in the United States, which was a period of intense activism around things like ending the Vietnam War, establishing the civil rights of Black people, and pressing for equal rights and opportunity for women, for gays and lesbian, and for persons with disabilities. At the time, we activists thought that a large part of our job, though certainly not all of it, was to correct many mistaken beliefs that were widely held by members of the American public. For example, that the war in Vietnam was being fought to preserve democracy against communist aggression, or that Black people were inferior to white people and needed to be kept separate from them, or that women were, by their natures, fit only for domestic and subservient roles in society, or that heterosexuality was the only morally accepted form of sexuality, or that disabled persons simply couldn't do certain things and needed to accept that. This is not to ignore the fact that powerful people had vested interests in maintaining these forms of injustice, but insofar as we were interested in producing accurate and useful theories of the problems that beset society, it was the propositions that were advanced in defense of imperialism, racism, sexism, and so forth that needed to be articulated and refuted. Those battles were, of course, never decisively won by progressives. US imperialism, racism, and sexism are all, unfortunately, still with us. New generations of activists have joined us old-timers in battling these familiar social cancers, as well as more recently identified ills, such as transphobia. Among these new activists is a group of philosophers who are arguing that what is needed at this point is a revision not of propositions believed, but of the concepts that compose these propositions. Here is philosopher Sally Haslinger, and I just want to say in a personal way, Sally is a very dear friend of mine, and we are constant comrades in arms in all these struggles, but she's completely wrong philosophically. So here's Haslinger. On my view, to say that I am a white woman is to situate me in complicated and interconnected systems of privilege and subordination that are triggered by interpretations of my physical capacities and appearance. Justice requires that we undermine these systems, and in order to do so, we need conceptual categories that enable us to describe them and their effects. She continues, much recent debate over race in particular seems to have become bogged down in the question whether this or that account of race can claim to be an analysis of our concept of race. I've maintained that my goal is not to capture the ordinary meanings of race. I'll go like this when I mean to be talking about terms. I've maintained that my goal is not to capture the ordinary meanings of race or man or woman, nor is it to capture our ordinary race and gender concepts. I've cast my inquiry as an analytical, or what I here call an ameliorative, project that seeks to identify what legitimate purposes we might have, if any, in categorizing people on the basis of race or gender, and to develop concepts that would help us achieve these ends. Now, Haslinger is saying several things here. Let's look just at the first paragraph, and I'm going to give you some paraphrases of the points in that paragraph. One point is that gender is a hierarchical social system, and that being a woman involves standing in the lower rung of this system. Another thing is that gender justice requires dismantling this system. And a third thing is that our current concept of woman, I think I'll go like this if I'm talking about a concept, and this if I'm talking about a word. And if that gets confusing, somebody say, "You're not making any sense," or something like that, and I'll try to disambiguate and be clear. Okay, so gender is a hierarchical system. Gender justice requires dismantling it. Our current concept of woman does not enable us to describe the system or its unjust effects. Now, I completely agree with the first 2 points. Haslinger and I are both materialist feminists in the sense that we believe that oppression is not just a matter of what people believe, but also a matter of the objective physical and social factors that structure our options and our choices. However, I disagree with Haslinger on the third point. I don't see why our concept woman is any less adequate for activist purposes now than it was back in the 20th century, when many of us were working with the same social analysis and pursuing the same political goals that Haslinger and I are both committed to today. In fact, I actually believe that it makes no sense to call for the revision of our concept woman. That's one of the points I'll be arguing for below. But to get everything onto the table, let's look back at the second paragraph. Here, and these will be my paraphrases again, here Haslinger is calling for a different kind of adjustment to our conceptual repertoire. She is claiming that, one, too much time is being spent by activist philosophers in trying to figure out what our concept of race or woman is. Secondly, that we should question whether it serves any good purpose to have such concepts. Third, if the answer to the previous question is yes, then we ought to try to produce better concepts that better serve these purposes. And this is the ameliorative project. So here, Haslinger is criticizing a type of philosophical project called conceptual analysis. It's not one that's pursued very much now by academic philosophers, but it was really sort of the main game in town in analytic philosophy in the middle of the 20th century. Haslinger is criticizing a type of philosophical project called conceptual analysis that aims to elucidate the concepts that we, and I use the term we advisedly, there's a very kind of peremptory appeal to what we think, and this was, these appeals were made by people who occupied a very, very high position in these social hierarchies. So at any rate, elucidate the concepts that we use in ordinary life. The procedure was to propose a definition of a concept, for example, knowledge, and then test it against speakers' intuitions, making revisions if necessary, until the revised definition pretty much accorded with speakers' judgments about what was and was not knowledge. Haslinger is suggesting that we give up on projects like that and instead ask what purpose a concept is meant to serve, with the idea that we might either give up concepts that serve no good purpose, like perhaps race, or else revise existing concepts to enable them to serve their purposes better. Here, too, I'll disagree with Haslinger on a couple of counts. First, I think once we have a concept, we're stuck with it. We can't get rid of it. Once we have the conceptual resources to represent a category, we have them, and getting rid of them would require something like brain surgery. Second, I think that the only purpose a concept has is simply to enable us to refer to or pick out objects and properties in the world. And referring to or picking out an object or a set of objects or a property is neutral with respect to whatever it is we want to assert about the objects or attribute the property to. And this is going to be a theme. I think that Haslinger and other proponents of amelioration, or as it's sometimes called, conceptual engineering, are failing to distinguish the essentially referential function of concepts with the assertoric function of propositions. I'm going to have bumper stickers made, which you can sign up for if you'd like one that say, "Concepts don't kill people, propositions do." And that was a joke, and you should just feel free to laugh uproariously whenever it appears that I'm trying to make one. I'll try to make these abstract points more concrete by working through the case of woman. But first, some general philosophical background. I want to start with the distinction between concepts and words. Words, or terms, are the primitive elements of language. Put together in accordance with the syntactic rules of a language, words strung together form sentences, which can be used to assert things, to ask questions, to issue commands, and to do all the other things we use language to do. Although the structure of human languages is governed by innate rules, the semantics of language, the determination of what particular words refer to, is in an important sense up to us. That the sound dog refers in English to the particular animals it does is a matter of convention. It's the fact that speakers of English all use the same sound to refer to the same animals that enables us to communicate with each other. Now, we know that this regularity, that we all use the same sound to refer to the same animals if we speak English, we know that this regularity is a convention as opposed to, say, a natural law, because different societies have different conventions to do the same job. The French use the sound chien, and the Germans use the sound Hund, just as the English regularize automobile traffic by requiring drivers to keep to the left, while Americans do it by requiring drivers to keep to the right. We can do the same job in different ways, and different societies choose different ways to do it. Conventions are thus, in an important sense, our creatures. We made them, we can change them. No one individual can do this unilaterally. Conventions essentially involve social cooperation, but enough individuals can, with enough time, manage to do it. We have seen plenty of cases where a word changes its reference. The word awful used to pick out a quality that Americans at least now express with the word awesome, and the word hopefully used to be an adverb of manner so that one could say, she walked hopefully toward the train. Nowadays, at least in the United States, the word functions almost exclusively as a sentence operator, meaning roughly, it is to be hoped that, which renders the previous sentence virtually uninterpretable. It would mean something like, I hoped she walked toward the train. In science, too, there can be what we might think of as semantic drift. So the word atom, originally in the Greek, or so I'm told, referred to the ultimate constituents of reality. As modern science developed, however, it became clear that the things regarded as atoms that formed part of the fundamental posits of modern atomic theory, it became clear that these things were in fact composed of even smaller things. Now, did the discovery of atomic structure mean that atom changed its reference? It's no longer the smallest things. Or did it mean that we discovered that, cleaving to the original reference, the things that the word atom had actually been applied to, did it mean that we had discovered that the things we had called atoms were not atoms? This is really an unanswerable question. The relation between words and their references is not definite enough or not clear enough for there to be a yes or no answer. One arena where there can be a clear yes or no, however, is the law. In order to prevent vagueness in enforcement, certain terms are explicitly defined, such as citizen, contract, homicide, etc. These legal contexts are also ones in which we can intentionally and abruptly change the reference of a word. In the United States, this can be done through a constitutional amendment, such as the ones that made formerly enslaved black men citizens and made women of all races eligible voters. In Canada, it took legislation to redefine marriage so as to make legal marriage between members of the same gender. In the US, it turned out that it was a court decision that said that marriage law that required the partners to be of different genders violated the Equal Protection Act of the Constitution. Wait for it, the US Supreme Court is reconsidering that decision, and most of us fear the worst about what will happen. Such changes can also be accomplished legislatively in the United States, as happened with the gradual elimination in state laws of the abhorrent marital exclusion in rape law. If you're not familiar with that expression, the marital exclusion, in the context of rape law, what it means is that it used to be, in almost every state in the United States, that the word rape was defined legally in such a way that it was legally impossible for a husband to rape his wife. The law presumed that a wife, in marrying, gave her husband blanket consent to sexual intercourse, making rape a legal impossibility. But this is all about words. What about concepts? Just as words are the primitive components of sentences, concepts are primitive components of thoughts. Concepts are prior to words because concepts are required in order for language to be acquired. Moreover, fascinating research on infants, which I'd be happy to talk about in Q&A if you want the details, fascinating research on infants makes clear that from the earliest testable ages, and we're talking 3 months, sometimes even younger, from the earliest testable ages, human babies have a rich conceptual repertoire representing the general properties of, among other things, physical objects and animals, antecedent to the sort of experiences that one might think would be necessary for the acquisition of these concepts. So empiricists about the structure of mind, who think that all substantive knowledge comes from sensory experience, I think have been empirically proven wrong. Babies know lots about animals, about human beings in particular, and about the behavior of things in the physical world. At 3 months, they just haven't had the relevant, the kind of experience that would be necessary for them to acquire these concepts through experience. Moreover, it's clear, again empirically, that non-linguistic creatures, quite a large number of them, are capable of thought. According to the developmental psychologists and ethologists whose work I follow or try to, many non-human animals are capable of quite sophisticated reasoning. All of our closest primate cousins, the chimpanzees, the gorillas, the bonobos, the orangutans, and many species of monkey, engage in what's called in the literature mind reading. That is, they seem to possess natively an understanding that others of their species have mental states, and they also have an appreciation of the structure of those mental states. Many other species, horses, dogs, cats, elephants, and many more, also appear to have such capacities. Interestingly, work coming out of Laurie Santos's lab at Yale has been, she and her postdocs have been investigating the mind-reading capacities of dogs versus chimpanzees. And dogs are better interpreters of human minds than chimpanzees are. Chimpanzees are good with other chimpanzees, but they don't know what human beings want. Dogs know if a human being is looking at something, that you want it. If a chimpanzee is flummoxed by some task, they don't think to ask the human. If dogs get flummoxed, they trot over to their owner and say, "Roar," and the human helps them. Okay, anyway. So the comprehension and reasoning, and I'm going to talk about another really striking piece of animal reasoning later on. The comprehension and reasoning displayed by these non-human creatures requires an internal, language-like system of representation. The philosopher Jerry Fodor made this theoretical postulate explicit and argued that humans and many other creatures possessed a language of thought, mentalese as it has come to be known. On this view, concepts are essentially the words in a native system of mental representation. When I speak of our conceptual repertoire, I'll mean the postulated set of mentalese words that form the basis of the thoughts we can think. Evidence that we have such an internal representational system, one that is independent of whatever public language we acquire, comes from many sources, everyday experience as well as carefully designed and controlled psychological experiments. Here are some samples from everyday life. 1, tip of the tongue phenomena. You've probably had the experience of knowing that there is a word that expresses the idea you have, but being unable to produce the word. This suggests that you are tokening the concept and just cannot locate in memory the word that expresses it. Let me see if I can induce this experience right now. See if you can come up with the name for the object that fits the following description, but don't shout it out, please. Here's the description. An instrument with a graduated arc of 60 degrees used in navigation, especially at sea, and surveying for measuring the angular distance of objects by means of mirrors. I'll read it again. an instrument with a graduated arc of 60 degrees used in navigation, especially at sea, and surveying for measuring the angular distance of objects by means of mirrors. I wonder how many of you have the feeling that you know what that thing is. Anybody? A couple of people. Do you all know the name for it? Does anybody not know the name for it? I couldn't think of the name for it. Okay, let's tell this gentleman what the name of this thing is. Anybody?
Sextant.
Sextant, exactly. I knew the word sextant, but I couldn't recover it when I saw that description. Okay, so that's tip of the tongue phenomenon. A lot of us have it with respect to names. My husband and I, when we talk about a movie we've just seen, will say, you know the one who is in that movie about the thing, and they went to the place? Oh yeah, she was great. And we somehow know what we're talking about, but none of us can produce the relevant proper names. Okay, so a second piece of evidence from ordinary experience is the detection of ambiguity. So consider the following sentence. Visiting relatives can be tedious. Let you think about it for a second. Now, raise your hand if you saw or grokked that there were two different things that this sentence could mean. Great, okay. Now, once you recognize that the sentence is ambiguous, you can probably formulate each of the two readings in a natural language. So you might say, one reading is, it can be tedious to visit relatives, and another is, relatives who are visiting can be tedious. But I'll bet that you recognize that there were two different readings before you actually formulated them in your head. Okay. The third one, and this is really important, for arguing that we need to extend this model of language of thought to animals. Planning. When you set out to do something, you often make a plan, but you don't often explicitly formulate the plan in language, even to yourself. You often do not articulate the plan in sort of talking to yourself. So think of cooking a familiar dish. You often go about collecting the ingredients, preparing them, cooking them in a certain sequence without formulating the sequence explicitly. The plan is in place, though, as you can tell from what happens if there's a glitch. Oh no, you think, I forgot to buy eggs. This is a thought you might articulate explicitly, but what about the intention to get eggs from the fridge? You go to the fridge expecting the eggs to be there. It's not like you say, I'm now going to go to the fridge and I'm going to get eggs, and then say, oh no, there are no eggs. You realize that there are no eggs when you open the door. The point that plans and intentions needn't be explicitly formulated in a natural language is also borne out by the fact that non-human animals can and produce novel plans. Crows, actually rooks, confronted with a novel situation. How many of you know the Aesop's fable about the crow and the pitcher? So Aesop told a story in which a crow is confronted by a pitcher, which the crow can't get his head down into, where there's a tasty morsel of something floating in the water. Well, some ethologists actually set up this experiment. So they have a tube of water that the crow can't get its head into. It's a rook, actually, which is a kind of crow. And there's water in the tube, and there's a tasty grub floating on the surface, but the rook can't reach it. There's also a pile of small stones next to it. The rooks were able to figure out, now this is not a setup that they have ever seen in a naturalistic course of things. They were able to figure out to drop stones into the tube. I'm not sure I would have figured this out. Into the tube to raise the water level high enough for the crow to pluck the grub out of the water. And there's some fascinating variations. So they tried it again with a tube that had sand in it and a grub. And the crows didn't try to drop the stones into the tube of sand. So the crows knew that the stones would make the water level rise and it wouldn't make the sand rise. Very smart. And they've tried this with young children, and the kids have to be about 7 before they figure it out. And then, as I said, I'm not sure I ever would. Okay. There's also a wonderful story about my dear departed dog, Freya, who spent one entire morning working out how to get hold of a donut that she saw somebody had tossed onto the sidewalk in front of her house. The fact that intention, you see, it was very complicated. She had to get me awake. She had to get me to get the leash, to put her on the leash. And then as soon as we got outside, she had to bolt straight for the donut before I had a chance to see it. Very complicated. Now, what, you may wonder, is the connection? Oh, I'm sorry. The fact that intentions must be formulated in thought using concepts is a point that I'll make much of in my criticism of the project of amelioration. What, you may wonder, is the connection between Mendeley's words, concepts, and words in a human public, or what is sometimes confusingly called natural language. This is a vast and unsettled question. One view that has been popular in philosophy and in some branches of linguistics is that concepts are actually determined by words in a natural language, that language determines the expressive potential of thought. This is a view that was championed by Benjamin Whorf, who you may have heard of if you know stories about how Eskimos are supposed to have 27 different words for snow, and this shows that they conceive of snow differently or something. That's actually not something that Whorf said, but it's often attributed to Whorf. But the idea was that the words in natural language determine what concepts you have in thought. But this view has been defended in a limited way by psychologists such as Lera Boroditsky. But the thesis that public language determines thought founders on the evidence for structured thought in pre-linguistic humans and non-linguistic animals that I alluded to above. Well, what about the other way around? Does our native conceptual repertoire determine what thoughts we can think, or can language extend the boundaries of thought? Here we need to separate two questions. The first is, can we acquire new concepts, or is our conceptual repertoire at birth what we're stuck with? We have to distinguish that question from a second question. If we can acquire new concepts, do we acquire them through language? I think the answer to the first question is yes. I think we can extend our conceptual repertoire, but that the answer to the second question is no. I don't think it has anything to do with language. That is, I think we can certainly acquire new concepts and that we can and do enrich our conceptual repertoire, but that we don't do it by means of language. When we coin new words, as we certainly do, we can only give sense to these words by recombining concepts, that is, words in the language of thought, that we already possess. Usually, new words are essentially abbreviations of complex expressions in the language of thought. So we've got primitive concepts, but we can combine them by conjoining them or by disjoining them or putting them in conditional relation to each other. So we can create complex concepts by combining them in various ways, various logical ways, out of the primitive ones. Insofar as new words can be defined in terms of combinations of old words, that is essentially can be defined, there's no reason to think that there's any expansion of our conceptual repertoire involved. Now, this is important to keep in mind with respect to the project of amelioration. There are certainly new words that come into use as the result of expanding knowledge of the world or as a result of cultural changes. But the addition of new words does not necessarily involve the generation of new concepts. Fodor, who I mentioned earlier, made an important distinction between the acquisition of a new concept, which he thought was not only possible, but something that happened all the time. So between the acquisition of a new concept and the learning of a new concept, which he thought was impossible. And he had something very specific in mind by learning. I mean, you could certainly use those two terms interchangeably, but he meant to be drawing a distinction. So learning, as he used the term, requires there to be a rational connection between the external circumstances that give rise to a concept or to a thought and the concept that results. Maybe looking at a case of acquisition and seeing the difference would be useful here. So one class of concepts that we can acquire is concepts for new animal kinds we haven't encountered before. And we can do it very quickly. You see one manatee, and you can recognize manatees from all over the world. Actually, there's something in Australia called a mungo, I think, that is a kind of manatee. Anything you can think of is actually in Australia. That's my experience. Giant stinging trees. Are you kidding me? Okay. So the thing is that we can, why do I say there's no rational relation? Well, it's true that an exposure to manatees or to a picture of a manatee is necessary to acquire the concept, but it only takes one exposure. And if you were thinking about this rationally, to come to a conclusion about what something is on the basis of one instance is not a very rationally laudable practice. But it looks like, especially with animals, our visual system is very good at pulling out defining central tendencies in the appearance of the thing that enables us to recognize lots of other members of the same species, even if they vary a lot in size and in shape. Okay, so this happens very quickly on the basis of one trial learning. But when Fodor contrasts that with what concept learning would be, the process would have to be different. If we could learn concepts, the process would have to proceed in this way. We would first have to generate a hypothesis about what the reference of the concept was, and then we'd have to test to see if that hypothesis was correct. So if we were learning the concept woman, we would first have to think, I bet that to be a woman is to be an adult human female, or whatever the hypothesis is. And then we try to figure out whether our hypothesis was correct. Maybe by saying of various individuals that we judge to be adult human females, so-and-so is a woman, and seeing if the others in our linguistic community accepted such sayings or corrected us. Acceptance or rejection of such sayings would be rational evidence about whether our hypothesis as to the reference of the new word was correct. Well, what's wrong with that? The thing to notice is, if we were ever to successfully carry out this process of forming and confirming hypotheses about what the allegedly new concept referred to, we would already have to possess concepts which, combined in the right way, refer to exactly the same thing as the new concept that we are learning. Therefore, if there is some process by which we can make genuinely new additions to our conceptual repertoire, where we can extend our ability in thought to think about things that we couldn't before, it cannot be by first postulating what the new concept stands for and then getting evidence whether a postulate is correct or not. The postulate has to already contain the conceptual resources for picking out what the allegedly new concept picks out. I'll later explain the pertinence of this to the debate about amelioration. Here's another essential point about concepts. Concepts are simply used in thought to pick out the subject of the thought. Tokening a concept is not to say anything about the subjects. To think to yourself, say, women bear children, is to first of all refer to women, whoever those individuals might be, and then to attribute to those individuals, to women, the property of bearing children. Now, think about this particular thought, women bear children. This thought can be true or false. It is true if the subjects of the thought, women, have the property that is attributed to them in the thought, namely the property of bearing children. Now, I bet that in this room we'll have differing judgments about whether that claim, that proposition, women bear children, is true or false. Some of you might judge that the thought is not true because of the fact that not all women do bear children. Some of you, though, might think, well, it is true in a general way, in the way that it's true that dogs have 4 legs or that birds fly. We know there are exceptions, but in general, dogs have 4 legs. In general, birds fly. If you have the second interpretation, you're interpreting the claim generically. And it's characteristic of generic claims that speakers of natural languages regard them as true, even though they're mindful of the existence of counterexamples. Now, the reason that I made that point about the sentence, women bear children, is that this is one of the cases where the linguistic representation of thought can be ambiguous. The same sentence in English can express any of these more specific thoughts. It can express the thought, all women bear children, which would be a false thought, or it could be bearing children is a distinctive property of women, that's true, or it could express the thought, most women bear children, which is also true. statistically speaking. The point I'm focusing on right now, however, is that the function of the concept women in thought is just to pick out the class of women. Now you probably want to know, well, how does this concept do this work? What about the concept woman connects it to women? And also, who are these individuals exactly, these women, to whom the concept is connected? Now, I cannot answer the question how this connection is forged, though I and many other philosophers have tried to provide theories of how concepts might be connected to their references. This was a hot topic in the philosophy of mind toward the end of the 20th century. There were several interesting theories that were put forward, and none of them work. They all have problems that even their proponents agree are problems. And so I think people just sort of ran out of steam with it. So it's an outstanding problem in philosophy. But despite that, we can say something about the question of what the references of concepts are. That is, with respect to the question, who are these individuals that the concept woman picks out, we have an idea how to provide an answer. So we can't tell how the connection gets made, but we can make some progress on figuring out what the concept is connected to. The general program, basically, is to gather up the individuals who a large number of thinkers will judge to be women, and then see what these individuals have in common. We understand that this is what we need to do in principle. It's difficult to carry the program out. Here's why. There's first of all the fact that thinkers sometimes make mistakes. They might see someone who's dressed in a way that's atypical for a woman in their culture and mistakenly judge that woman to be a man, that is, not a woman. This is a kind of perceptual mistake. We make perceptual mistakes all the time. I'm driving out in the country in Massachusetts where I live, and I look off to the side and I think, oh, there's a horse. It's not a horse, it's a cow. But I look quickly, it's a dark night, I mistook a horse for a cow. This is a perceptual mistake. There's another kind of mistake an individual might make. They might have a mistaken belief about what properties an individual has to have in order to be, in my example, a woman. Such a person might believe, for example, that in order to be a woman, an individual must be capable of bearing children. This person would then judge an infertile female or a postmenopausal female or a trans woman to not be a woman. Now, I'm going to say that this could be a mistaken belief because they could be wrong in thinking that the property that's picked out, that all the things that our women have in common, they might be mistaken in thinking that that property is the ability to bear children. Now, another inherent difficulty in trying to characterize what it is to be a woman, that is, what it is to fall under the concept woman, is that women, whatever they are exactly, will have many properties in common. In fact, most women have a great deal in common biologically. They have the same chromosomal properties, 2X chromosomes, they have the same general endocrinology, that is, their hormonal structure is the same, and they have the same morphology, overall body shape. But not all women share these properties. Many of you are aware of the existence of intersex individuals who do not have the precise set of biological properties typical for either males or females. Yet, many intersex individuals are women. Now, I'll just mention that it's important to realize how rare intersex births actually are. The vast majority of human beings, the lowest estimate I've seen is 97%. Do fall unambiguously into one of these two biological categories. I make this point because many philosophers think that the existence of intersex individuals show that the properties of being a female or being a male are not, well-behaved properties, that they're not, that there's really a continuum and that there isn't really a distinction. I think that's a mistake, and I think that the political hay that people try to make out of that are points that we can make without having to say anything about the nature of biological categories. One thing is, nobody seems to complain about the use of male and female in connection with non-human animals, but it turns out that intersex conditions occur in non-human animals as well. It seems that when when a cow is carrying twins, if the twins are of different sexes, both of the individuals are affected, and neither of the two individuals, twins, is unambiguously either a cow or a bull. Okay. Apart from women who are biologically intersex, there's also the fact that many girls and women lose one or more of these biological properties, either permanently or temporarily through illness or accident. Now, these considerations prompt many theorists, including myself, to argue that the commonalities that actually unite individuals into the category women are a matter of the social role women play in human societies. On this view, women are united as a class by a system that assigns distinctive social roles governed by distinctive norms about dress, behavior, and occupations to individuals, usually at birth, on the basis of what is perceived to be their biological properties. Feminists who believe this will often say that woman is a social concept, not a biological concept, meaning that our concept woman picks out or is connected to individuals who are assigned or who come to play a certain social role, one that is generally and for the most part attached to the biological property of being female. The analogy I like to draw is between our concept of a parent, which I think is a social concept, with a concept that I have made up a word for that I call progenitor. So if you are the contributor of sperm or ovum to the creation of a human being, you are a progenitor. It seems to me perfectly clear that not all progenitors are parents, and even clearer that not all parents are progenitors. So parent is the name of a social role, a social relation to a child, whereas progeniture is a biological relation. And there's, of course, a non-trivial or non-arbitrary connection between being a parent and a progenitor. Okay, now this disagreement about whether our concept woman picks out biological females or individuals who occupy a certain social role is, in my view, a question of fact about what our concept actually picks out. It is a very difficult question to answer, but there's a fact of the matter, and it is independent of what we might believe or want to be the case. What our concept does pick out is predetermined, and what it picks out determines whether our thoughts involving the concept are true or false. Now, this may sound very bad to progressive ears. What I'm saying is that if our concept, woman, picks out individuals who have biological features, then this will have the consequence that the thought, trans women are women, will be false. And that is, I absolutely agree, a difficult conclusion to accept. This is where amelioration might look attractive. Suppose you might think our current concept has the reference female human being. Can't we just change it? Can't we revise or re-engineer or ameliorate that concept so that it has a reference that includes trans women? The answer, I'm afraid, is no. In order to make such a change, we would have to use the old concept in framing our intention, our plan, to change its reference. It would amount to thinking woman, in the old sense, should mean woman in the new sense, but such a thought would be incoherent. The first occurrence of the concept, woman, in that thought retains the old reference, which is in conflict with the intended reference of the new meaning. Maybe we could introduce a new concept, but we can't change the reference of the old concept. We can add to our conceptual repertoire a new complex concept. It would be woman or occupant of the social role generally occupied by women, but that wouldn't change the reference of the component concept, woman. That seems, I agree, politically inadequate and offensive to trans women, even if their own concept, woman, has, unbeknownst to them, that content, and maybe even morally repulsive. Now, I think this sort of consequence is one of the things that advocates of amelioration have in mind when they call for revision of our concepts. But if amelioration is impossible, what can we do? Well, quite a bit. In first place, what the impossibility of amelioration shows is simply that if the reference of woman is determined by biological properties, then it cannot be changed to be determined by social practices. But no concept. If the if part of that conditional, if the reference of woman is determined by biological properties, The if part of that conditional might be false. Indeed, the very strong intuitions that many of us have that trans women are women is in itself evidence that the reference of our concept woman is not determined biologically after all. If woman is in fact a social concept and not a biological concept, that means that those who think the thought trans women are not women are wrong as a matter of fact. Those of us who realize that this is a true thought must then work to persuade those who think this that they are wrong. This would be analogous to persuading someone in the 18th century who thought whales are fish that they were wrong because whales are in fact mammals. The mistake such a person would be making is the same as the mistake made by someone who thinks trans women are not women. That is, they'd be incorrect about the properties that actually make an individual of the type in question. They'd be mistaken about the properties that unite the individuals that are the referent of their own concept. That would be a very welcome result, politically speaking. There's another issue about the properties that determine whether an individual falls within the reference of a concept or not. Haslinger, in the quote above, says that to say that she is a woman is, quote, to situate her in a complicated and interconnected system, to situate her in complicated and interconnected systems of privilege and subordination, end quote. And then goes on to recommend that we ameliorate our concept of women to reflect this fact. Now, I agree with Haslinger that the gender role woman is part of a hierarchical system of privilege, and that it has been a regularity in human societies that the women in those societies, that is, the individuals who are assigned the woman role, are subordinated, often severely so, relative to men. It may even be that this is a property that, in fact, is one of the properties that determines the set of individuals that our current concept, woman, picks out. If it is, then there's no need to revise or ameliorate our concept. If it is not, then it's impossible to revise our concept if my arguments above are correct. The crucial point to realize here is that whatever the properties are that determine what the concept woman refers to, possessing the concept does not mean knowing what properties connect the concept to its reference. That's going to be an empirical question, and just deploying the concept doesn't mean you have access, a priori access, to what the properties are that the referents have in common. So even if Haslinger is right that being subordinated is one of the properties in virtue of which woman refers to women, no one has to know that in order to use the concept. Compare. The concept water refers to substances with a chemical structure H2O. That chemical structure is necessary to being water. But for most of human history, and probably even today, most people who have the concept water don't know this. But suppose we did introduce a new abbreviatory concept, call it woman sub, that is defined to mean individuals who are in a subordinated position relative to men. Then the thought women sub or subordinated would not be an interesting substantive thought. It would be akin to thinking bachelors are unmarried. It would express a conceptual rather than an empirical, discoverable fact. And it would be a fact of no political significance because it would simply be a fact that follows from the concept itself. That's an unwanted concept. So amelioration is not something that is politically desirable, even if it's possible. There are two more things I want to say to mitigate what may appear to be morally or politically discouraging consequences of the view of concepts I've been defending. First, concepts, as I pointed out earlier, are not propositions. They are elements of propositions. This means that having a concept with the reference biological females does not condemn a person to being transphobic, nor does having an inclusive concept ensure that one is trans-friendly. One can construct the proposition trans women should be allowed to use ladies' rooms with either concept, and one can deny it using either concept. So if you have the inclusive concept, you can say, not all women should be allowed, and you're transphobic, you can say, not all women should be allowed to use ladies' rooms. The content of a proposition is not determined by the subject concept. It's determined by that concept plus the other concepts and the structure in which they are put together. The second thing I want to say is that So I think that the part of the impetus behind the Amelioration Project is to build these facts about women into the concept. What I'm saying is that would turn every thought that you make about women with respect to those properties into an analytic truth, into a truth by definition. The second thing I want to say is that while the reference of our concepts is not under our control, the reference of our words is. So getting back to some of the earlier arguments I was presenting, in particular, we have the power and politically the duty to ensure that our laws, institutions, and ways of speaking respect each other's identities and realize our ideals of justice. Language is powerful, and it is our creature. Thank you very much. I think I'll come sit.
Questions? Keep your hands up so I can see you. Yes.
So let's say Hassanger agrees that you've shown that you can't change, you can't as it were alter a concept. You can swap a new concept in for an old one. So she might recommend that we drop woman as you understand it and introduce woman sub and make it an analytic truth that women are subordinate. And she might say, I mean, you said that it wouldn't be politically expedient to do that, but you didn't, I wasn't sure why you said that. Maybe she would think it would be politically expedient. And also it's a bit weird that then, as it were, women couldn't be released from the subordinate role. But
Right, that's right.
But let's say that she, I mean, does it make prior to that, does it make a difference to her project if she conceives that all we can do is swap one concept in for another and then says, you know, then you've got an argument about whether it's politically expedient to do so or not, but it wouldn't make, does it make that much difference to her project if she grants your main point, I suppose?
Oh, well, I think it should, because first of all, I don't think you can swap them out. I think once you get a concept in your head, you're stuck there. But you could add this concept in sub, right?
But she could say that's the one we should use, and we should try to avoid using the other one or something like that.
Yes, well, I mean, there's a whole other lecture I could give about what it means for us to use one concept rather than another, and you know what it would mean politically to know which concept somebody is using. But if we did use women sub, I mean, suppose we get a trans vote to get that concept in their head, they'll cheerfully agree that women, somebody who thinks that men and women are equal in social roles or equitable, they can cheerfully agree that women sub are subordinated. That just follows from what it is to be woman sub. So that doesn't join the political debate where it should be joined, which is that women are subordinated. That's a fact that we can discover empirically, that's a fact we can argue about, but it's not a fact we can argue about if the thought is women sub are subordinated. That's like arguing about whether bachelors were married.
I mean, I can discover in a sense that triangles have got three sides empirically. I mean, in a sense, I can go out and look at a lot of triangles and find out, oh yeah, they are. I mean, although it's an analytic truth. And maybe it's useful for it to be built into the concept of triangle, they've got three sides. Maybe it's useful that the notion of subordination should be built into the concept of women. I mean, I can see what you say about the transfer, but it's, perhaps she thinks just great that it should follow conceptually. You know, we should just have those connotations in mind. That would be helpful. Oh. I don't know, something like that.
Okay, so I mean, another thing is, and this is where I think political education and changing people's beliefs is important. You know, people. If someone is kind of naive about the subordination of women, or, as is true in the United States, doesn't really think there's systematic racism. I mean, you know, most people are goodwill and they believe the races are equal to everybody. What you need to do is not say, well, I'm going to give you a new concept. Racism subsystematic. Racism subsystematic and existing in the United States is something that exists in the United States. That's pointless. What's important is that, I mean, what I think is going on is what we want to do is we want to take the concept of racism and look at the instances of it, and then make the case empirically that the instances that my interlocutor would agree are paradigm cases of racism have something very important in common with these other cases that they didn't recognize to be racism. I want them to learn that these sorts of situations are racist situations, not accept the definition of something that makes it an analytic truth. About the triangles, I don't know if it's analytic or not. Kant thought it wasn't. I think mathematics actually is extremely interested and complicated psychologically. And psychologists are trying to figure out how we go as a species, and there is a species that has, we've got a lot of several different systems for estimating the quantity of things, all but one of which we share with lots of other animals. The thing that we can do that no other animal, as far as we know, can do is understand that numbers are things. I'm putting it tendentiously, but essentially being able to realize that the sequence, the kids learn very early on, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that the position in that sequence indicates a cardinality. That turns out to be, psychologists are trying to figure out how it happens. It's not there right at birth, but emerges pretty early, and you can't train. Even the smartest animals just can't get it. So anyway, just on the point about triangles having 3 sides, the main point is if you build the fact into the concept, the fact becomes trivial.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Maybe I should say that.
No, I also been trying to move so you can actually see it. I have a question about the necessity aspect of your argument with respect to things that can either be seen as natural kinds or at least scientific terms. And I think that, at least for the examples of things like, because you mentioned species,
Yeah.
and I think there are numbers of ways in which those have been either revised in sort of Richard Boyd style, then going from sort of what you see is what you get to homeostatic property clusters.
Yes.
Or you might get something with respect to chemical kinds, like the Haysock-Chang style, where saying H2O is necessary for water. That's only if it's a molecule, as compared to a mass noun, as compared to something like heavy water.
Yes.
So I'm thinking in line of this, if we can revise those particular concepts, and can we revise either particular biological concepts that have to deal with the antecedent of your conditional, or can we revise social concepts that you're talking about that can still be used even if you deny the antecedent of your conditional?
So what I would say in these cases is that we're not revising concepts. We are putting forward different things that might be what the concept refers to. We're disarticulating things that we might not have realized were disarticulated. So, and also, in science as in math, we sometimes stipulate that a certain term is to be used in a certain way, and we'll actually spell it out. So the debate about species, when a vision scientist talks about our ability to get what a species is from one encounter, they're talking about species in the sense that tracks visually accessible kinds. Obviously, they're not saying we can visually determine whether 2 animals, well, when we visually judge, let's say, a dachshund and a Great Dane are both dogs, we are in fact making a judgment that entails that these 2 things share a phylogenetic history. But of course, we don't need to know anything unless we know anything about the phylogenetic history, or even that phylogenetic history is involved in what makes some of these species. So I think that in these cases where we articulate distinctions that maybe weren't appreciated, or we come up with new ideas about what a concept refers to, we're not actually changing our conceptual repertoire, though we might be saying, here's a combination of concepts that you wouldn't have thought to put together, and putting them together and using this word to express them is a useful thing to do. And that might be what the amelioratist has in mind, but I take umbrage at the idea that it involves changes in concepts.
So I think it's a similar question about, it seems to be that we must be able to forge new concepts that aren't just, as it were, clusters of definite descriptions when we make discoveries. So, even given the whole story that we've evolved with this very, very rich set of concepts over millennia, But we then like go somewhere where no human has ever gone before, or no animal has ever gone before, and we discover a new element. Or,
Yeah.
And it's just wrong to think we've just got a descriptive. We've discovered something new, and
Yes.
we need a new, whether you think concepts of mentalities or capacities or whatever it is, you need a new capacity to be able to think about it. And so to follow on the thought, if that's the case, and you gave me that, then if we went to a far distant planet and we found, I think Helen Stewart gives this example, we found this H2O, which is like a pink solid. It's an isotope of H2O, and it's pink and solid, and there's something about the weird conditions that
Yes.
make it. We then have a decision to make.
Yes.
Right? And I don't think it's just a decision about a word. We've got the concept water. It's now just indeterminate, I take it, whether the concept of water we've already got covers this new isotope or doesn't cover this new isotope. And then what would happen? I guess the scientists would have a big old meeting, and they might decide, you know, like jade or the other way around, emeralds and sapphires, right? Made of the same stuff, but we call them jade.
Different, yeah.
But jade made of different stuff, but
Jade,
look similar. So
two different minerals, yeah.
So that there might be like a vote or something.
As has happened with the amazingly vigorous controversy over whether Pluto is a planet.
Yeah, okay.
The New York Times, like you can search for this, did a very long article about the nature of that debate. It was excellent. It presented the scientific evidence, the definitions that had been in use, the definitions people thought should be in use, what it entailed for the judgment, why it is important to people, whether Pluto was a planet or not. It was great. But so that's one example.
So the question is,
yeah.
human beings, that we make discoveries not just from far planets, but we transform our ways of living with each other, and we just have genuinely new modes of living. So don't we then, without it being an ameliorative practice, don't we then, there is an indeterminacy now about how our concept's going to operate, and so we need to make sort of certain forms of decision about how it's. And I don't think it's just a word thing.
No. So I want to say two things about this. First of all, I do think we acquire new concepts. The gentleman back there mentioned Richard Boyd's view of what a natural kind was, that it was a homeostatic property cluster. So for those of you that don't go home and read philosophy of science in your spare time, or as a profession, homeostatic property cluster is a phenomenon in the world where you see some set of properties frequently co-instantiated, and where it turns out there's some explanation for why they go together. And I think that this applies to social kinds as well as not. I mean, I think social kinds are natural kinds because we're part of nature and we make social kinds. But Ron Mallon is a philosopher who has explicitly extended the notion of homeostatic property cluster to social kinds, to race, for example. And I would extend it to gender. I think that you see clusters of properties co-occurring in human societies, and there's an explanation for why those properties go together. In the case of a social kind, the binding is not independent of human thought and action. So in the case of social kinds, we can take them apart by rejecting the beliefs that do the binding. So if the social category race is, as Anthony Kwame Appiah has argued, fundamentally organized and disciplined by the widespread belief that there's such a thing as a racial essence. Since that's false, if we can get enough people to change their beliefs, the kind will sort of, there won't be anything holding it together in this very principled way. But I do think that we are sensitive to homeostatic property clusters. So I think that the experience of this co-occurring property cluster where we can kind of grok that there's something that is keeping these properties together. It's not just an accident. I think that can trigger a new concept. But we haven't learned the concept in photosensitive learning. We haven't projected a hypothesis explicitly. If we do, and that's when we get the concept, then the concept is going to be a complex concept that we've used old concepts to construct. But if it's really something new, and I think that happens in science a lot, and also in social science, then yes, we got a new concept, but it wasn't learned. There was a second part of your question toward the end, and I've forgotten.
So maybe my question is, what's the connection between the learning claim
Yeah.
and the argument against amelioration? It looks like why?
So I think we can make...
What does the fact that it wasn't learned mean that we can't do that?
So if I set out, as Hannah suggests we do, to take a fact that we've learned about women, that they're always socially subordinated, or a fact that we've learned about racial groups, that they are the product of, they're an artifact of social domination and not a reflection of innate differences. We take that and we form the intention to get a concept that expresses that. Then we have to articulate what the that is, and then that's a demonstration that we already had, at least in potential, the wherewithal to express that concept. Now, I will say, abbreviations are really, really useful in thought as well as in real life. I mean, if you're running a computer program and it's complex and you've got to call lots of subprograms, you don't rewrite the program. You have a call. You have a name for the program, and it says, run multiply here, or something like that. And that saves a lot of time computationally. It's the same thing for us. The way we represent a problem to ourselves has an effect on how easy it is to solve it and how easy it is to think of things. So I think when taking, for example, Miranda Fricker's example, which she thinks is a kind of, I don't think she uses the term amelioration, but she thinks that women were disadvantaged by not having the concept of sexual harassment, and that it's something that they acquired or that they learned through consciousness raising groups. Well, I think that my view is that what was going on was that people could articulate the phenomenon, but that consciousness raising allowed people to recognize some facts like it wasn't your particular way of dressing or your particular way of talking or you're being too flirtatious. It was not an individual thing. It was something that women experienced because they were women. So that sort of that aspect of the phenomenon was something that needed to be highlighted. But we could define sexual harassment, right, using old concepts. It's just very, very, it's much easier to push one's political aims and to press for change and to get the law to say the right thing if we have a term and correspondingly a concept that abbreviates that one thing.
Okay, yeah.
The essence of my question is, how do we know what concept we're holding? So I think that I hold the social concept of woman, but how do I know that I am not sort of persuading myself that I hold this when I really hold the biological thing, but I want to be a good progressive?
Yeah.
How do I know I'm not doing that?
Okay, so one thing is, the way we generally figure out what concepts we have is by testing our judgments in various cases. And, I know, there's another aspect of Lucy's question that I just realized, and this is pertinent to your question as well. It could be that our concepts do not reach all the way through logical space and classify everything as either in the extension of concept or not. And then, I'm not sure I want to say that it's a matter of decision, but then we have to sort of see how our judgments work out, where they fall. My mother, God rest her soul, I don't think I don't think it ever occurred to her that somebody could be born with a male body and then become a woman. I think that would just blow her mind. And I think probably her concept just didn't reach out into the world to classify cases of trans women. So I think that we do sometimes have concepts that are inadequate in that they don't classify things. That the extension or the reference set of things that the concept clearly classifies doesn't include all the possibilities that there are. Now, not to worry, because having a concept doesn't mean making a judgment. So suppose you have a biological concept, and there can be, of course, individual variation. And you've been talking about whether, I've been talking as if our concepts are all species-wide, but there could be individual differences. So suppose you think, it turns out that your concept applies to biological females. You can still express the thought that people who are not biological females, that is, people who are not women, should be accorded respect of their identities and should be allowed to participate in sports categories that are labeled women, go to use toilet facilities that are labeled ladies, and so forth and so on. You can have all the right views about how people should be treated and how society should be organized, even if you have to do it with concepts that don't classify things the way you think they ought to be classified. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Skeptical?
Yeah, I mean, I always look a bit skeptical.
Oh, okay.
That's my general life. I think it's just that I feel like if we can't re-engineer concepts, it's important to be able to identify the ones we actually have.
Well,
Or would you say it isn't?
I don't know, because I mean, what we do, right, we all operate with the concepts we have. And what we do is we find ourselves sometimes in disagreement with somebody. And sometimes in a local way, we can do this with words. We can say, wait a minute, when you're saying somebody is a woman, you seem to be assuming that to be a woman, they have to be biologically female. And I'm not assuming that. Now, if the argument just boils down to that kind of person should be called a woman, no, they shouldn't be called a woman, you know, then you're kind of at an impasse, even if we're just talking about language. But the thoughts that you think, first of all, you can express your concept, woman, even if it's a biological concept, with an English word, woman, that, again, if we're out in the realm of public language, we've got some control over what these words do. In a way, we don't have control of concepts, because the concepts are prerequisite of meaning anything. And it might be the most politically important thing is to make sure that the relevant laws and institutions mean by the word woman what we want them to mean.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Hi. Yeah, so I found it quite, your point on the contrast between humans and animals in the context of the perception of mathematics is quite interesting. And since you just postulated, I personally think that wild animals can be just as able as children to understand the distinctions between 1 and 2 and so on and so forth. But I just feel perhaps it's because children are wired into that sort of frame of thinking because there's the demand and incentive around them constantly around in a matter of civilized like living in this civilized world. But surely an animal can be just as able, surely if they are provided with such an incentive or demand, such as a child is. Yes.
Well, there was this big project in the late 60s. Declared that it was a humanly, it was distinctive human, language was a distinctive human trait. Not that communication was. Lots of non-human animals have communication systems, but the particular communication system we have that has all these crazy rules that from a general engineering point are just wacko. I'm trying to think of a good one. Well, you can't double case mark a noun. Why not? So if my daughter has some friends, and each of the friends has some books, and I want to refer to one of the books of one of the friends, I can't say one of Rachel's friends' books. That's just going to be ambiguous, because I can't double case mark book as being both objective and being dative. What is that? Objective and no, I can't case mark friend as being both the object of Rachel and also a governor of an object. I mean, that's ridiculous. In first order predicate logic, we can do that easily. But language has these very, very idiosyncratic rules that seem to just come with the territory. So there was this big push when Chomsky sort of threw down his gauntlet of trying to teach apes and chimps to use language. It was an utter disaster. The animals were very intelligent, but what they could not do is discipline themselves to produce. They were taught ASL. That was the thought, was that the only reason they couldn't use language was they couldn't articulate verbally. You know, hours and hours and hours, hundreds, thousands of hours went into training, for example, Nin Chimpsky. That was the chimp's name. There's a horrifying, moving documentary about Nin Chimpsky. I can't tell you the name of the documentary, but it's awful what happened to this poor animal. But Nim could not be disciplined to producing the signs in the right order, and Nim never learned the functional aspects of ASL that deaf kids can pick up, hearing kids can pick up natively under casual circumstances. I would challenge your claim that, I would ask you why you think that, why you have reason to think that animals could acquire this kind of numeric knowledge. The system that most animals use to estimate quantities is one that obeys the Weber-Fechner law, which means that as the quantities increase, the differences between two quantities have to get greater and greater before you can notice the difference. So 1 and 2 is easy. 2 and 3 is pretty easy. So if you're dealing with small numbers, it looks like the animals do have the concept of 1 or 2 or 3, but really they have this kind of smear of quantitative understanding. So if you get up to 7 versus 8, the animals, you can get your best Skinnerian in there to do the best schedule of reinforcement that they can come up with. You can't get a pigeon to learn. Pigeons might get up to 6 or 7, but you can't get a pigeon to discriminate 16 from 17. Human beings can't do it either just by eyeballing it, but they can count.
But perhaps this is a matter of there's just an inherent demand for us to have this perception, but if you introduce that to Fernando over time, perhaps in the evolutionary perspective, that you should be able to perhaps develop the same skills that we have in this context of large numbers, surely.
We have, our ancestors in the Pleistocene were very irresponsible and did not leave us videotapes or, memoirs or anything that we could use to find out where the number system came from. But presumably, there's no reason to think that we are much different cognitively from our ancestors, our Homo sapien ancestors. There's speculation that Homo sapiens could make maps, that they had a kind of geometric understanding of things that enabled them to represent where they lived, and they could range widely and then come back to the right place, and that Neanderthals couldn't. And that's why we won. But it really is just speculation. But I really would like to know, right, what demand task or what task demand could have evoked mathematical knowledge, especially if the thing didn't have the conceptual repertoire there already to produce it. Bear in mind, there's lots of evidence from the period of human development where there were historical records, lots of evidence that people did arithmetic. And nothing has changed about us cognitively between then and when we have people like Cantor and Gödel proving theorems in advanced mathematics. So that The stuff is there. There was some kind of saltation. There was some kind of leap. And I would, again, challenge you to figure out why you think it's more likely that this was something evoked by the environment than just a change.
I mean, from a physics perspective, when we look at the squirrel, for example, there has been innate evolutionary advancements to the point where they can calculate in their heads somehow conservation of angular momentum in the concept of when they fall off a tree, for example, how they can take advantage of their terminal velocity to land safely on a...
Yeah.
I think that sort of understanding, that sort of knowledge, it's not implanted through us innately. It's not a matter of like nature, but I mean.
I say it's not innate.
Oh yeah, sorry, it is innate, but
was
surely evolutionary.
Hang on. First of all, not all evolution is a matter of natural selection.
That's a fair point.
There are lots of, it's an important point because biologists, evolutionary biologists, as opposed to physicists who read a biology book and start really important. Evolutionary biologists think it's an empirical claim to say that a trait is an adaptation. And it's darn difficult to demonstrate that. You have to demonstrate lots of things. Like you have to demonstrate, first of all, that the trait is really a trait. That is, so people used to say, what's the evolutionary function of the chin? Well, it turns out the chin is not a trait. There are two different growth processes that are controlled by different genetic mechanisms that, as they are expressed in the human face, cause these bones to come together to form a chin. There's no function of the chin. It's just a spandrel. It's just a consequence of the physics of the operation of the genetic, of the production of the proteins. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, we know that there are lots of creatures going much farther down the great chain of being, if you will, that perform amazing computations. Bees, honeybees, amazing. So, they do these waggle dances. They go out and forage for honey, and they come back to the hive, and they waggle their behinds, and the angle of their orientation indicates where the hive is, and the frequency of the waggle indicates how far you have to go. That's amazing on its own, but here's the thing. There'll be many bees at the hive who've gone foraging in different places, and so they're all doing different waggle dances. B1, who observes B2 doing a waggle dance, stores the information about where B2's nectar source was. And here's how they know. If you destroy the nectar source of B1, it flies out and there's no nectar there, it goes through dead reckoning to the place where B2's nectar source is. So it doesn't go back to the hive and go from there. It performs a calculation on what it has calculated is the source of the nectar. That's all in the bee head. The bee can't do much else, but that's what it does. It's a very complex computation. And probably it's an adaptation. It seems like it sure should be. It certainly seems like bees that have it are going to do better than bees that don't have it. Any of these very specific, especially visual motor coordination routines, they're inborn in the individual organism. Their history might be a selectionist history, but for ontogenetically, where it comes from in the organism, it's not a matter of experience, it's there at the start.
Thank you.
Maybe I just simpler to take on what is becoming much more prevalent today as a non-binary view of humans when it comes to sexuality, sort of a spectrum where we don't have it. In other words, that would then cover a great variation with who we feel we are with our sexual relationships.
Well, I certainly think there's more fluidity and variation, and the variation is continuous with respect to our sexual identities or our gender identities. The 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 biological dimorphism is extremely robust. It's really, they're real, I mean, to say that 3% of human births are intersex births, where it's indeterminate whether the person is male or female. 3% is an extremely high estimate. Most estimates of intersex condition, the occurrence of intersex conditions, are more like 1.2, 1.7%.
Yes, I'm hearing a confusion here. You were just talking about, not so long ago, about some man or a man who wants to become a woman.
No, I try to be careful not to say that.
Oh, I thought I heard that.
Maybe. What I hope I said was you have an individual who's identified as male at birth, who later in life affirms that, I don't know exactly what I said, but I tried not to say a man who wants to become a woman. I tried, what I intended to do was to phrase it very carefully so that I was not committing myself to the individuals actually being a boy, but rather focusing on there being, I might have said male, which I take to be different from being a man. So if you're born with a certain morphology and chromosomal profile and chronological potential.
Well, we're talking about males who wanted to be a woman, though. You gave a description that
okay.
It's very hard for us to imagine this could be a reality. The older people, I mean, it wasn't.
Oh, my mother. Yeah, I mean, she just wouldn't have known what I was talking about.
Oh, really?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess, trying to think of, I guess Christine Jorgensen was a well-known person in the 50s, 40s. So my mother might have heard of that person, but I think she would have thought that this was a man pretending to be a woman or something like that. The thought that the person really was a woman would have...
Well, yes, and as I was trying to bring out when I started, that I do know from experience that there are men who have more of the female sort of qualities that we sort of recognise, like the qualities of their mother, say.
Okay, so, well, see, now we're talking, I think, about what, I think we're getting into what gender is and what it does. So I think that there really is a very wide spectrum of psychological characteristics, emotional profiles, and that what gender does is gender can't change those things so much as it can discipline them. So boys who are, my son, who identifies as a man, when he was young, he liked to paint nail polish on his fingernails, and he actually wanted to wear a dress to kindergarten. And I, in a cowardly way, said no, because we lived in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I just could not deal with the blowback of that. But I did make him a satin cape that was studded with stars. I'm such a good mother. But you know, he loved it. He loved it. He wore it all the time. But one time he just looked at me this way and he said, "Mom, why are the pretty things all for the girls?" And in fact, well, he had another friend. He had a friend who's a boy. He came over to the house one time and Paul painted his fingernails. And his father nearly punched out my husband. I mean, he was so furious. And my husband, Joe, said, "What are you upset about? Are you upset that he's going to be gay?" I mean, first of all, what would be wrong with his being gay? But secondly, you think that somebody who isn't gay, if you paint their fingernails, are going to turn gay? So I mean, there's this, you see this a lot. I see this a lot in the United States, that simultaneously there's this feeling that absolutely people are heterosexual, that's the way nature made them, but then on the other hand, they seem to think that their sexuality is just enormous, so malleable that you wear a dress or you put fingernail polish on and you're going to turn gay. So it's a very, very chaotic, illogical kind of way of looking at it. But absolutely, I mean, this is why I say that gender it's a homeostatic property cluster that is disciplined by false beliefs about which traits are male, which traits are female, and by norms that get people to conform to expectations, even if they're very uncomfortable with them.
Well, Louise, thank you very much. That's a good note on which to end, because you've just given us a very succinct summary.